Hey everyone, Gary here, and today I'm going to be talking about Fang and Fur, Blood and Bone, A Primal Guide to Animal Magic by Lupa. So this book is essentially, again, about animal magic. There's about 7 chapters in the book, each detailing a certain degree of, well, animal magic. The first chapter talks about animal totemism. She covers the history, the definitions of animal totemism amongst indigenous cultures as well as amongst neo-pagan traditions. She mentions that animal totemisms amongst indigenous cultures are usually there. It was not so much like your own personal like spirit guide, but like a family or clan sort of guardian. But more or less, like the kind of practical practices she uses in this book are, more or less the neo-pagan definition, which is a person's essentially a spirit guide. She talks about finding your animal totem and as well as working with your animal totem. She doesn't put any like animal dictionary in the book, which I think is great. Her main goal with this kind of book is to kind of leave it open ended for the reader to kind of push you in the right direction and then allow you to make your own conclusions. She does mention that to really understand an animal totem, you got to look at its real world counterpart, because that's really how these people discovered the nature, found the nature of animal totems. I'm going to move on to the second chapter. Now, the second chapter, she mentions familiars. She talks about the responsibility it takes in taking care of a familiar, as because I think it's something that is quite important. I mean, you're working with a real live animal. It requires a lot of care. It requires a certain amount of space, and you got to make sure you have the money to support it. I mean, she talks a lot about animal welfare in this book and talks about taking care. Like don't leave your cat outside because there's a lot of dangers outside for the cat. She talks a lot about looking for animal shelters for animals. She says you should avoid looking to breeders and pet shops. I can't really speak much for the animal trade. I'm not really much of authority, but she does mention that animals, in pet shops as well as amongst in the animal trading industry, that animals are treated like shit. And on to the third chapter, because this is one I found pretty interesting actually, because and that's mainly because she mentions the use of like invocating or like invoking like fictional animals from fictional animals, and it's something you never really would think of, as a practitioner. But again, what she mentions is that our fiction is sort of like our modern mythology. I mean, she does mention in this chapter as well as working with mythological animals too. She mentions how certain animals kind of represent an aspect of this, the human psyche. Like how deities, represent certain parts of the human psyche as well. She mentions deity associations, deities, like animal associations with deities. She mentions that Woden has the crows and the wolves. She mentions also working like with again fictional animals as well. She talked about working with mythological animals, etc., etc. And her fourth chapter, she talks about making your own your own species of animal. She talks about the considerations of what this animal's like, its nature, what it eats, how it reproduces, like its behavior, etc., etc. She also mentions like aside from just hybrid animals, she mentions like human like centaurs and other sort of creatures. She even mentions making your own like personal pantheon of like deities. She mentions like how certain like attributing a certain animal can kind of it would I think in some way would interpret that deity's behavior, like associating, a hunter deity with a shark, you know, may make it make it may make it a hotter deity if if you as opposed to like say an animal that's associated or a deity that's associated with a dolphin. I mean that was kind of interesting. I'd never really thought about it. She talks about like how to really you know in the chapter how to bring that sort of animal to life. Like she mentions getting a representation of your fictional animal and breathing life into it. Like using a ritual to create this you know personal deity or animal totem, what have you. And then in the next chapter, she describes shapeshifting, both on the physical level as well as on on like the actual spiritual level. Like I mean, you hear stories and folklore about people who actually have shapeshifting animals, but mostly she talks about the spiritual invocation, the use of a pelt to kind of guide you in your shapeshifting, etc. She also mentions otherkin, which I've heard of otherkin. I actually do know somebody who is an otherkin. An otherkin is somebody who has like a they have a nature about them that's not really human. A lot of them often say they have like the soul of an animal. Lupa mentions having like a wolf part of her. I have a friend who actually says she's a human with a wolf soul. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And then her next chapter talks about working with animal parts and the like the ethics of how companies treat certain animals. He talks about using cleansing rituals for the parts, because a lot of the a lot of the parts you do find are often animals that have been mistreated, and of course you got to cleanse it because obviously there's a lot of negative energy associated with that animal part. Yeah, I don't really work with animal parts. I don't know. It's probably not something I'm going to use extensively, but it was definitely an interesting chapter. And the last chapter, she talks about animal sacrifice, which obviously has a lot of disclaimers. But I think this is a chapter that I think really stuck out to me because as somebody who does practice Santeria, that does have animal sacrifice in it, as well as somebody who does practice heathenry, as I believe Nicholas Graham in this book mentions. That's I guess more or less somebody who also contributed to that part of the section of the book. He mentions I think he makes a good argument here that the animals people often are against animal sacrifice because of cruelty, but then we also ignore the fact that animals are treated like in comparison to how animals are sacrificed in like these rituals, they're often treated more humanely than they are in slaughterhouses. In fact, slaughterhouses, they're pretty much treated like shit. I mean, you can watch any freaking PETA video and you just see like these animals getting kicked, across rooms and you know, people just killing it. And it's not even dying on the first blow or even the second blow. I mean, it's killed in a very inhumane manner. Whereas with animal sacrifice, most of them anyway, or at least they should be, they're practiced in a very humane manner amongst santeros as well as amongst heathens, of groups who do sacrifice animals. I think this is definitely an interesting book. It definitely does. I think it definitely does make you think about a lot of things that you wouldn't really consider doing. Especially when it comes to working with animal invocations. And it's definitely a very interesting book, and it's definitely something I would recommend. I do hope I did this justice. Lupa is watching this video, so I'm a little bit nervous. But yeah, I definitely do recommend this book. Definitely do buy it. I bought it off Etsy, and I do have it autographed, which is pretty cool. Let me just show you that right there. I don't know if you can see that. It says, "May you be inspired to create wild magic, Lupa." Yeah. Anyway, that's about it. Explosive Orange signing. Not Explosive Orange. Wait, that's my other channel. Gary signing off.